Now, households with incomes of between 25,000 and 40,000 rand a month are feeling the pinch of higher costs in the current economic climate. The Old Mutual Savings and Investment Monitor survey shows that as these households are feeling financially stressed, they have chose to do away with domestic help in efforts to save money. So this means that more and more domestic workers will be out of jobs. We're joined by Tekie of the Izwi Domestic Workers Alliance to unpack this. Amy, very good afternoon to you. Thank you for your time. Households, especially middle-income households, are taking a lot of strain from the cost of living, the rising cost of living. It means that domestic workers are being used less. What is your reaction to this?
Thank you for having me. It's not a surprise. We've been seeing this definitely since the onset of COVID-19, and even before that, there's often kind of a roller coaster of domestic work employment according to the economy and other factors. So we saw quite a deep dive after during the first quarter of COVID-19, and then it's increased again and now going down again. Most of these cases we don't see. I would say probably 2% or less of domestic workers in the country are actually affiliated with any sort of union or domestic worker association. And so the vast majority of dismissals, retrenchments, or unfair treatment are never visible or reported. But we are seeing a lot of retrenchments.
Well, this trend can be attributed to seasonal changes. What has come out very strongly is the increased cost of living at the start of this year. And, of course, all of that comes on the back of COVID-19 and also its harsh impact on many pockets across the country. What does this now mean for domestic workers who are being left without work in an economy that's already volatile? How does it impact their day-to-day lives?
Well, obviously, lack of employment for workers who are among the lowest paid workers in the country and are primarily breadwinners for families brings destitution, and that's what we saw severely during COVID-19. Within weeks, there were families that literally women that couldn't feed their children. I think what's happening in the sector is that often employment is transferring to people who will take less. We had, for example, one of our members was interviewing for a job and asked the woman to send her the details, and she was asking for 10, 12-hour days for 2,300 rand a month. You wouldn't be able to leave the house unless you were with her in her car. You could get one weekend off a month, etc. Your room would be searched to make sure you were cleanly and orderly. Your phone would be searched. So there's a lot of employers out there who really don't think that labor laws apply to domestic work. And when this employer was approached with the labor law, she said, well, other people will take the job, so it's fine. So I think what happens is some employers, obviously not all, some employers decide that they can dismiss their current worker and find somebody who they feel will put up with exploitation and lower wages.
And that's unacceptable. How much of an effort has government made to formalize the sector and ensure that the domestic workers are treated better?
You know, there's kind of two angles to that. The first angle is in the last few years we've seen obviously the inclusion of domestic workers in in COIDA, the Workers' Compensation Act, which was a constitutional court victory a couple years ago, and as well as finally granting them the full minimum wage, which was quite a battle. So the constitutional court and the government is starting to see that domestic workers, there's no basis whatsoever for treating them as a subcategory of unequal workers or less than professionals. But at the same time, we don't see really any effort at all from the Department of Labor to hold domestic employers accountable. And so really the only way employers are held accountable is if workers themselves stand up and say this type of treatment isn't fair. And that really puts them in a very difficult position unless they're willing to lose their job.
And with the increased fragility in the sector and more and more households opting to do without domestic workers, they are still needed in homes. What do you think are some of the ways around it as opposed to full-time employment and the other options that can be used under a pressing and highly pressured economic climate for households?
Well, since COVID-19, we've definitely seen employers reducing the number of days, and that's perfectly legal as long as it's a process, and they go through the retrenchment process and retrench the person for those days and then have a new contract for the new number of days. And another, I think, option a lot of people are turning to are some of these online digital platforms like Sweep South and Domesly, where they can kind of either have someone on an ad hoc basis or once or twice a week, which is attractive for people who don't like the responsibility of having an employee. And I think there's ups and downs to that. I think it does, in some cases, suit workers. It gives them flexibility and it helps them to find employers, but it also means that, again, nobody is being held accountable because there's no official, it's the gig economy and there's no official employer when you're hiring someone off a platform for one afternoon.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think now needs to happen to be able to tackle these big concerns? I mean, if people think that labor laws don't necessarily apply to them as employers of even a domestic worker who would come in for a few days, what are the big changes and the big shifts that are needed in terms of perhaps a change of mindset and an enhancement of the sector?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the point isn't that we must be hiring domestic workers for as many hours a week as possible. It's that we must be treating them as professionals. And so if you can't afford to keep someone full-time at the wage you're paying them, rather than hiring somebody for less, take that person and reduce their number of days so that they can then find other work or other activities during their time off. And I think if workers are paid a fair living wage where they can actually afford to buy the food that their kids need and their school shoes and all of these things, we can start to see a little bit of an increase in levels in reducing the power disparity that happens between employers and workers. And so it's really about professionalizing the sector. And I think a very small but important thing is to just start with contracts and pay slips. And that's something that I think most employers don't bother with. And often they think, no, we have an agreement and she's happy and I'm happy. But when a worker doesn't have a written contract or pay slips, it limits their ability to get a rental unit, to get loans, sometimes to send money overseas, to do a lot of these things that are part of day-to-day life because they don't have anything in writing and they also don't have any job security. And so if we can start with something simple like job slips, pay slips, and of course UIF registration and COIDA registration, which is by law required of employers, and it's illegal to not register your worker, but again, most people don't do it. Those things can kind of set the basis for employers to realize this is I am officially employing someone and therefore it is my responsibility to know the labor law. Mm-hmm. We do have a guide online that we did with the Socioeconomic Rights Institute called the Guide to Employing a Domestic Worker. That's at izwi.org.za. And that's freely available, and it's got all the details of kind of everything you need to know from a legal and practical perspective.
How much should employers be paying domestic workers? Because government on the other end has said that employers, are failing domestic workers themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, the national minimum wage, I'd have to check exactly. I think it's at 23 something at the moment per hour. And so that does need to be calculated on a per hour basis. Mm-hmm. But just again to remember that's a minimum wage. It's not a living wage. And so you are going to be in a situation where you're paying somebody who's not available who's not making enough probably to meet all of her needs. In terms of an exact number, it varies so widely, between rural areas and urban areas and different neighborhoods. It's hard to pin down, but I think the importance is to make sure you're paying above minimum wage. Make sure that you're paying overtime for anything more than 45 hours a week or 8 hours a day for a 5-day week. Anything beyond that has to be paid 1.5 overtime. Sundays have to be paid double unless it's part of weekly work. Public holidays are off. All of these things that people often ignore. You can't tell your domestic worker, oh, Monday's a public holiday. Can you come in Wednesday instead? She does have to be paid for that Monday. So minimum wage plus make sure that you're just meeting the legal requirements. And of course, the extent to which you can go beyond will probably also impact the quality of work that you get. Often employers complain about, oh, she's slow, she's not focusing, she's messy, etc. And then you find out they're paying, 2,500 Rand a month below it, and of course you're not going to get good service and you're not going to have someone you can trust if you're stringing them along with barely any pay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Amy Tekie of the Izwi Domestic Workers Alliance, speaking to some of the very pressing challenges in the sector, with more households dropping domestic workers in light of the current economic challenges that are being experienced, with more households feeling more pressured. Of course, also focusing on some of the laws that need to change to better the environment in the sector.